And now to language, that marvelous liberating medium. The medium of thought of any degree of complexity, of reasoning of any but the simplest variety, of interpersonal communication, of stored knowledge, and also, if Wittgenstein is right, the source of all the bewitching perplexities of philosophy. Language, we want to say, is the vehicle of thought, or words and sentences are the clothing our thoughts put on when they make their appearance in public, or they are the outward and visible or audible manifestation of the inward and spiritual thing. Yet we also feel we must acknowledge the force of the idea that at a level of any complexity, the availability in our language, in the vocabulary and syntax of our language, the availability of a sentence for expressing a thought is the condition of the possibility of thinking the thought. After a point, what we can't say, we can't think. So our language, or our languages, come to seem like an autonomous and highly structured realm with all the thoughts we might think lying in it. And yet again, in a sense, we are masters of this realm. The language, a language, is our language. There are limitless sentences and combinations of sentences of which we know in advance the sense, the significance, though we shall only ever use, or read, or hear a comparatively insignificant proportion of them. But even that comparatively insignificant proportion, which we so readily frame and utter, understanding what we say, or which we hear or read, understanding what we hear or read, even this is vastly numerous. So how is it that we have this vast and potentially limitless understanding?
The place I go to in Aberystwyth was originally discovered by my brother and cared for by him for some years. I took a very strong liking to it when he got it first. I do work there, and actually for me, I mean, it just is it's a good way for me to think. I don't know about other people, but it's a good way for me to think by walking, you know. I mean, some rhythmic motion. If I bear the linoleum in the various seminar rooms in which I lecture by just pacing up and down. I just think that way. And I love to walk around that part of the world, so that's why it's very suitable.
Is there something about the natural surroundings which is important to you?
Oh, well, I think only to the extent that it encourages in me a certain amount of abstract speculation. Or indeed, I found when I was in America in lots of places, the impact of the place and the very obvious problems and issues and arguments, the actual physical surroundings imposed upon you, forced you to think about other subjects and questions. And to a certain extent, I find the country good for thinking philosophically, rather than being in London or something. There's tension always when I'm there, because there are always things I like to do there better than I like to do philosophy. No mistake about it, I find doing philosophy extremely hard, right? Except on the very, very few moments when one's had a very good thought, and one's like riding a surfboard into the coast. You've caught a wave and you ride it. And so it's hard work, and up at the cottage, there are all kinds of things, I mean, tremendously well justified by the economy of the place, that you have to do, like chopping wood and repairing the roof and all kinds of wonderful things. Actually, it turns out now that I've hit quite a good balance, because I find I do half an hour or so, and then I go off and mend a pane of glass or something, and then while I'm mending the pane of glass, I think back on a bit on it, you know, and then go back and write something. I can't just slog at it very often uninterruptedly. If I'm writing a lecture, a lot of the time I'm always sitting. It's rather embarrassing. Occupational hazard for a philosopher is that his his moments when he's most hard at work are those where he's most indistinguishable from sleeping.
To what extent do you think that your investigation of language is the investigation of an organic structure, of a living form?
Living. Well, I think probably it is something which I don't allow myself to forget, that language changes, you know, and is changing all the time. Take two ways in which that influences you. You know, there's a pretty elementary distinction between names, proper names of people, you know, Evans and so on, and descriptions, you know, the guy who's got long hair or something. You know. There's some moderately obvious distinction between those two forms of referential device. But I think it's very, very important to understand, to the understanding of both of them, to see that an expression can change from one category to the other over time. And you've got to have your distinctions, your taxonomy and your theory capable of allowing for that.
Peter Strawson is now Professor of Metaphysics at Magdalen, but he only took up his chair there quite recently. Up till a few years ago he was college tutor at University College, which is where I met him, just in the normal course of events. As an undergraduate there, I was taught most of my philosophy by him. Most of his early stuff, his published stuff, as far as I know, was on logical theory, things on necessity, entailment, and of course the famous quarrel with Russell on the theory of descriptions, during the course of which he introduced and tried to refine, and over the years increasingly tried to refine, the idea of a speaker's referring to something. This idea moved very much to the centre of the stage in his book Individuals, where he asks questions about how the world must be in order for a speaker to be able to refer to things like events, bodies, persons, sounds, nations, and so on. Since Individuals, he's written on a variety, quite a wide variety of different topics, but an experienced Strawson watcher will be able to detect underneath the surface the persistence of the concern with reference and with the distinction between particular and general. I don't think I came away from being taught by him with a whole set of philosophical doctrines, or dogmas. What he did manage to communicate to me was an idea that certain subjects are very interesting. As time's gone on, I've disagreed with him more and more about particular matters, for example, the whole debate between him and Russell. But what has persisted is my conviction shared with him that the subject of reference and the distinction between particular and general, for example, is a subject of enormous fascination. So if I gave a student one of Strawson's things to read, say his book Individuals, I wouldn't give a damn if he thought that it was all wrong. What I would mind is if he couldn't see that a very wide range of very interesting subjects were being discussed in a fruitful way.
Do you think there's any sense in which philosophy differs from other disciplines in that its results should ultimately be intelligible to ordinary people? Intelligible to non-philosophers, which is clearly not a constraint physicists operate under, although no. Perhaps they are intelligible, they don't have to be intelligible.
Well, what I think is true is something like this, namely that philosophers must try to explain the relationships of ideas which every person, every man as a man, has to operate with, has to use. Ideas like that of knowledge, truth, personal identity, perception. These are ideas with which everybody is bound to operate as being a man, and these are among, at any rate, and importantly among the ideas which it's the task of the philosopher to explain, and to explain the interconnections and relationships of. But whether it follows from that his results and even his questions, except the most general question of all, must be able to be made intelligible to everybody, I'm not clear.
No, I agree. I don't suppose it would follow from that. But isn't it, I mean, aren't there some concepts, I suppose you would say these are kind of second order, they're thrown up in the investigation of these basic ones, that generate some philosophical problems, I mean, logical form, entailment, and that sort of thing. Do you think the philosophical problems connected with those are of a different kind?
Oh, well, it might well be, because, of course, there are philosophical problems which go under the title philosophy of mathematics, which go under the title philosophy of physics, and on your own showing, since nobody is required as man to be interested in or know anything of physics or higher mathematics, a fortiori, nobody can be required as man to be concerned with the philosophy of these subjects. But I would go further and say that concern with these ideas, which are everybody's property, which everybody willy-nilly operates with, is the fundamental concern of philosophy.
Ah, well, I mean, what captured in that word fundamental?
Well, I think the tendency to, and perhaps I approach you here, the tendency to ask philosophical questions, or to think philosophically, is possibly endemic in the species. The children ask philosophical questions, worry about philosophical issues, and of course when they do so, it is precisely about these common notions that we all employ that they think. But I think I want to say that in another sense handling these notions is fundamental, because I really think too that to explain the more sophisticated notions probably requires, to explain them adequately, probably requires an adequate philosophy of the common notions.
Yes. Yes, then that gives, I think, a more solid sense to fundamental. Yes. The sort of thing you have in mind for children would be the sort of fascination with what happens at the end of the world and that sort of thing, and infinity in general, mystification.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Yeah, well, I don't know, would infinity fall into your category of things that man has to operate with? I mean, in a sense it's cross-cutting, because he doesn't have to operate within it, but in a sense also it's perplexing for every man.
As soon as he starts thinking about the disposition of things in space, or the series of events in time, questions of a very profound nature come up.
Well, yes. You talk about handling these things.
Right.
Is it just the philosophy is concerned with laying bare, tracing paths between these central concepts, causality, person, body, space and time, and so on? Is that really what it's all about?
Well, I think it is what it's fundamentally about. I think that there are certain concepts or classes of concepts which are absolutely basic in our scheme of things, in everybody's scheme of things. Notions like space, time, persistent body, re-identification, identification, person, action, belief, knowledge, and all these form, to my mind, a web, a closely connected, an interconnected set, and one can't hope to get really and finally clear without tracing a complex set of connections which bring all these in relation to each other.
Yes, well, isn't that a bit pessimistic in a way, because since the list is so long, and I'm sure you don't think you've exhausted it, it's a bit like there being a building so large that you can never take in account its proportions all at once. I mean, perhaps there's something impossible about complete philosophical understanding, but what I suppose I'm skirting round is the question: has the critical, has a critical role gone for the philosopher in the way you envisage it?
I can't think of one.
So everything is all right as it is?
Let's say provisionally, yes.
Yes. Would you, I mean, not only do you believe that, but do you actually have an argument to think that it's right? I mean...
I think this. There's no privileged, unique position from which we can organize and understand, and if necessary criticize and throw out, bits of the current commonly shared human conceptual scheme. There is no such position. On the other hand, of course, we can criticize not so much elements of the scheme as human beings actually operated, but typical philosophical misunderstandings of the way they actually operated.
Yes. But it's central to that way of looking at it that their operation and philosophical views about their operation are very distinct. In other words, very much a rejection of what I said a moment ago, that ordinary people might take up positions on philosophical issues just by doing business.
Not by doing business, but by doing business, by carrying on their ordinary transactions with each other and the world. There they use, they deploy, they employ these ideas, but they don't, except in a trivial sense, espouse a philosophical view. They might be said to espouse a philosophical view in a trivial sense, in that, as it were, they observe, if I may be allowed the analogy, the correct grammar of those concepts in using them. But this, of course, is a very far from saying that they have any notion of what that grammar is, any reflective and conscious notion of what that grammar is, and this is the role of the philosopher, precisely to exhibit it to them, or to himself.
I wonder... I suppose it's because I think that yes, how to put it? I mean, God provides the precedent, to put it like that, for someone who wanted to say that human beings can engage in a great deal of talk which they think they understand. Structured talk, whose structure may be laid bare by a philosopher.
Yes. God's uniqueness made him uniquely difficult to relate to everything else, and of course the unthinking multitude made use of the notion, as did the learned, but the learned had great trouble in saying how to fit this notion into the other set of notions that they could handle.
Well, let me try again. What about soul? Here's a part of the scheme of ordinary, perhaps not completely ordinary, but it's not rarefied either. The soul of a man, and people have all kinds of beliefs about it. You know, possibilities of its antedating birth, but certainly possibilities of it going on, all that sort of thing. And when you try and lay bare the connections, work you've done, they're not very satisfactory. There are connections, but they're not very satisfactory, or if you like, they're contradictory connections, or something like that.
There is a distinction here between the case of the soul and the case of God, in that you can make perfectly good sense of talking about human beings' souls in a way which fits in with the rest of the scheme, although it may not be the sort of sense which is acceptable to, say, religious believers.
No, but the critical question is whether it is the sense attached to it by ordinary people.
Well, see, the word soul is one among many, isn't it? Mind, personality, temperament, thoughts, and so on.
Well, I'm particularly thinking of the soul as with its possibility of afterlife, that sort of thing.
Oh, right. Well, so long as it is connected to a set of transcendental beliefs, then it suffers from the general deficiency of other such beliefs. So long as it's integrated with one's way of talking about human beings anyway, then we can rescue it and make sense of it. Clearly, we don't learn the meaning of every new sentence independently. The whole point of the fact of the infinite potential is that we don't need to do this. So out of some limited means or materials is generated this potentially limitless understanding. And here we have a problem which engages many thinkers in the philosophy of language today and is likely to continue to do so for some time to come. It seems it must be solved by crediting us with implicit mastery of a structure of general rules or principles of combination of linguistic elements, a grasp of a grammar or syntax, in fact, and that this, together with a grasp of a finite vocabulary of elements, which do have to be learned independently and individually, these together contain in themselves and explain the possibility of this limitless understanding. But where shall we look for the abstract underlying structure? Here the logician, or the semantic theorist inspired by logic, may modestly raise his hand. The central consideration, he points out, in understanding the significance of sentences is a grasp of their truth conditions. To understand a sentence is to know what thought it expresses, or is capable in given contextual conditions of expressing, and to know this is just to know what we would be believing if we took that thought to be true. Now suppose we understand the basic notion of a true predication, of truly applying a concept in an individual case, the notion schematized in logic in the forms of atomic proposition. We can write these forms, as you know, and as I've done on the board, as fx, fxy, etc., where the x's and y's are placeholders for names of individuals and the f's are placeholders for predicates. Now, of course, for this structure to have content, we must also learn the sense of individual predicates. The difference, for example, between the truth conditions for predicating is blue and those for predicating, say, is square or is a tiger or something. But this will be so for any structural explanation. Formal logic, on this view, supplies the necessary structural key for an adequate semantic theory for any natural language. Now, the semantic theorist who thus takes his stand on formal logic is aware that adjustments are necessary before this key will turn. To illustrate the point with a very simple case, take the two attributive adjectives good and bad and an indefinite list of nouns such as hockey player, draftsman, king, husband, and so on. It seems clear that in mastering the semantic force of the two adjectives, we've also mastered a very simple rule of combination such that, given that we also know the meanings of the relevant nouns, plus the notion of predication and conjunction, we can put the right semantic interpretation on an indefinitely large class of sentences, of which are instances, sentences 1 and 2, on the blackboard. Sentence 1, Charles is a good husband and a bad king. Sentence 2, John is a good hockey player and a bad lecturer. But now, if we turn in a naive spirit to formal logic to help us with the elucidation of the principles of our semantic understanding here, we are immediately in a dilemma. We can't treat these sentences in the spirit in which we can treat, say, my sentence number 3. John is a 38-year-old hockey player and a long-haired lecturer. With this one, number 3, we can just render it perhaps as a conjunction of 4 simple predications which could be redistributed in any order without affecting the truth value of what's said. We can treat it in effect as John is 38 years old, and John is a hockey player, and John is long-haired, and John is a lecturer, and so on. But to apply the same treatment to sentences 1 and 2 would be semantically disastrous. It would lead, for example, to the result that sentence 1 is equivalent, as regards truth conditions, to sentence 4, Charles is a good king and a bad husband. So that won't do. So in general, no simple manoeuvre stands the slightest chance of displaying, as subject to the structural rules of logic, all those structural features which are quite obviously at work in generating sentence meanings out of sentence elements. So the semantic theorist who follows this line, who takes his stand on logic, is bound to work hard at recasting whole classes of ordinary sentences in such a way, as he would put it, as to reveal their true logical form. And studying them in their restructured, recast form, he hopes, we shall be able to see how just the same logical principles are really at work in determining their meanings as we see at work in those well-behaved sentences of ordinary language whose true or deep logical structure is simply mirrored in their surface appearance. And the idiosyncratic semantics and syntax of particular natural languages will, on this view, be complete when we have framed mechanically applicable rules which will enable us to transform the superficial structures of all sentences of a language into their deep or true logical forms. Well, now, this is one program, and a program to be treated with great respect. But I don't think we can say that it has an exclusive claim to be treated as the right way to set about the problem.
In this lecture we've just heard, you characterize a way of doing the semantics for a natural language, such as English, the formal logician's way of doing it, and you hint that this isn't the way you yourself think the subject ought to be pursued, though you treat it with a considerable amount of respect. Can you perhaps explain what you think wrong with doing it that way?
Well, in general, I think it's unrealistically restrictive. Let's take an example of the sort that's been discussed recently. Let's take John kissed Mary in the garden at midnight. Now, this is typical, of course, of a whole host of sentences in which we say that somebody acted in some way, sometime, somewhen. And part of our understanding of these sentences is knowing that, for example, John kissed Mary in the garden at midnight can be true only if John kissed Mary, period, is true. Our grasp of this logical consequence of the inference of John kissed Mary from John kissed Mary in the garden at midnight is part of our understanding of this class of sentences. This is true of the whole lot of sentences of this class. Now, it might look straight off as if our understanding of this feature of these sentences was to be explained by our having hold of a fairly simple rule. After all, it's in the nature of action that when people act, they act somewhere, sometime. So it seems we can, given an action predicate, like kissed, always modify that predicate by combining it with a locality specifying expression, like in the garden, or time specifying expression, like at midnight, to form a modified predicate which will be true, which will hold true of just those agents of which the unmodified predicate, John kissed Mary kissed, is true. We might call this form of combination adverbial modification, right? Now, here we seem to have hold of a perfectly general and perspicuous principle, our grasp of which is sufficient to account for our grasp of this general logical feature of these sentences. But if you accept the approach that I was critical of, then you can't accept this. And the reason why you can't is that the predicate calculus, that is to say, the form of logic, of current logical theory, which we're talking about, and which is regarded as the framework for semantic explanation by these theorists, the predicate calculus simply doesn't allow for this style of predicate modification. It isn't catered for in the forms of the predicate calculus. So what are the theorists of this style to do? Well, what they do is to say that we understand the logical consequence here, we understand this type of sentence, because we really understand it as of a different form from the form it superficially appears to have. And to render this different form in something like ordinary English, one might say the sentence, John kissed Mary in the garden at midnight, really has a form like this. There is a kissing which was by John of Mary, and which occurred in the garden, and which occurred at midnight.
In other words, the logician doesn't have to claim that somehow he's reporting on a stage of mental activity in providing his perhaps regimented sentences. What he really wants to say of them is that they represent, in a clearer, more perspicuous form, a form in which the possibilities of inference, of entailment and so on are more clearly realized, and in another way more clearly related to other forms of inference. They represent these better than the ordinary English sentences themselves.
Well, of course, by talking of a process, I didn't mean to saddle him with the suggestion that we actually went through this process, only that it was, so to speak, available to us. Even if this is made quite clear, why is it that we, as it were, go so remote, so far from the explicit, from the forms that we really understand them to have, and instead, as it were, mask them as having a form that they, on his view, don't?
Well, he might point out the way language has been built up. It wasn't built up like a French city with, or an American city, from that point of view, with the streets laid out before. It's built up like a very ancient city. There's a long history, and bits are added on here, and they're fashioned to fit into the sometimes very unideal slots that are already left. I suppose what's interesting is not merely the negative aspects of criticism, but your positive treatment of these things, the extent to which you have an alternative to the conception of semantics given by the formal logicians.
Yeah. Well, I think what we have to bear in mind is what the object of the whole exercise is. The object, isn't it, is to explain the ordinary speaker's mastery of a limitless range of sentences, his grasp of the meaning of a limitless range of sentences and of their logical relations. Now, how do we do this? Answer, because we credit him with mastery of a limited set of rules of combination or styles of combination and elements.
Well, to give, yes, let me think again through this by suggesting another example and seeing what you would say of it, and seeing again if I can see the blank wall that I saw gazing me in the face before again. The old problem about good and bad and all that sort of thing. You know, I mean, here's the problem. You get.
Well, I actually set it out in my lecture.
Oh yes, of course.
In other words, what solution is to be offered to the problem of attributive adjectives of an evaluative sort?
Yes.
You could also admit this category too. Admit the category of evaluative or appraisal words, point out with respect to them that the criteria for their application depend upon the type of thing you're applying them to, if you take these two facts together, you'll see that you won't begin to know the truth conditions for calling an X a good X unless you know what sort of thing an X is, or what the value of X is here.
But with those, I mean, taking good knife, for example, which in a sense raise a good number of the problems which good king raised.
Right.
Would you suppose there to be some sort of algorithm for getting the meaning of the compound good knife from that of the element knife, together with the what you said about good?
Right. Suppose you took king as a sort of functional term, like knife, so that in a sense you haven't grasped the concept knife unless you know what properties it's required by those who require knives to have. You might say king was like this.
That's
he kings it well. He's just and firm and so forth. But of course, what complicates the matter with these evaluative predicates applied to social phenomena is that standards may change. I mean, elements of evaluation may change over time. So it isn't quite a straightforward semantic issue in the way in which perhaps the conjunction of an evaluative word with a purely instrumental object like a knife might be.
I see. So, at least for that class of cases, it wouldn't be true that you'd need, under the entry for knife in the dictionary, some statement as to what properties you had to have to be a good knife.
Well, let me ask you, do you think you understand good oscillograph?
I'm going to have to reveal my ignorance. No.
But then surely you would want to say, in a way, you understand it perfectly well. I mean, there isn't a clear yes or no answer here, is there?
Well, when it becomes a yes or no answer, when it becomes interesting, I suppose, is to say, I mean, it isn't just a trivial matter as to what we're going to count as understanding. When it becomes interesting is to whether we think this is part of the province of explanation for semantics. That's really what I'm getting at. What is an oscillograph, by the way?
I'm a bit vague myself.
Yes, but the reason I'm worried about that is this sort of point. In some sense, I want to say that in coupling a term like cat with a term like run, all right, you in order to understand it, you've got to know what sort of state of affairs is being asserted to obtain. And I can't put this point very clearly, but you see what I'm getting at.
Suppose you took the expression not cat runs, but water runs.
Ah, yeah.
Now,
yeah.
You see, if you
nose runs.
Well, if you wish. If you think the primary application of the word runs is to some creature with legs, and they twinkle, and that's the matter of the thing running, whatever their particular movement looks like. But obviously, at any rate, plausibly, when you make the jump from animal of any species runs to water runs, there is perhaps a real inventiveness here, a real touch of a real extension of your vocabulary, which is in a sense rather mysterious, because obviously it isn't already covered by the semantics of runs, and yet it's graspable, it's humanly graspable.
Yes. And the critical question is this something that semantic theory should try and explain, or can it explain?
Well,
that's really what I was getting at, you see.
Yeah. But what does seem to me important and interesting is that there really aren't any rules here.
Well, in a sense, they can't be.
No. Whereas in the sort of semantics we've been talking about, the whole idea was to explain human capacity by reducing the styles of combination we have to general graspable rules. It seems to me in this sort of extension, which is perhaps only a relatively trivial example of something much more important in human thought, rules are not to be had.
Right. In a sense, of course, what happens the minute rules are to be had, in other words, when the metaphor becomes dead and conventional, it precisely loses it ceases to draw upon the imaginative capacity talking about.
Right.
But you see, what's interesting, well, or one of the things, I made the case rather difficult for myself by starting with man and cat, but in a sense I want to say, you can't draw the line where this extension stops. That's really what I was...
But that's good, I think, because surely when the child learns, he doesn't learn abstract specification for running, like legs moving relatively fast in relation to each other. He learns it in relation to, say, a dog, perhaps, or himself, or something like that. And he does make this extension to cat, and even in that, you might say, there's an element of imaginative creativity or something of the kind. And that ties up with something I said in my lecture, which seemed to arouse some sort of response. I said that what you can't say, you can't think. And there was something not quite right about this, because of course we, as it were, constantly enlarge the boundaries of our language by these creative or imaginative steps. It's still, in a way, true, but it doesn't mean that you're bound within the language as it is at any particular stage.
No, thank God for that. I mean, what an awful, in some sense, nightmarish prospect it would be if that were... Interesting enough, there's another kind of fact.
Actually, well, how misused the word creativity is by those linguists who refer precisely to our mastery of an indefinitely large number of sentences, but by virtue of mastery of a certain restricted set of rules, refer to this as creativity. It isn't creativity at all.
Exactly. Your creativity obviously comes in where the rules give out.
Or where you stretch and go where you stretch.
Well, I mean, actually, we don't want to fiddle over the word creativity. I mean, in a sense, they can have creativity because, in a sense, we know what they're talking about. One can understand new sentences, but...
Why give them a good word? Now, if we ask, what is fundamental to thought at large, not thinking about subject matter on the one hand, or even logic on the other, I think we're bound to say that the most fundamental feature of all is a certain dichotomy, or duality, perhaps better, of, on the one hand, the notion of the general, the universal, the repeatable, in different cases, and on the other hand, the individual case, the particular case. And obviously this dichotomy is represented in logic. It's represented in the basic notion of predication, of saying of the individual case that it's of such and such a character. But in logic, this notion has an entirely general, subject-free character. Now, might we not see the unlimited generality of logic, the notion that it's totally indifferent to what you're talking about, be it numbers or objects of an ordinary kind or not, the unlimited generality of logic as arising out of an extension, a kind of imaginative extension from this basic case on the strength of certain analogies, not of a subject matter kind, but of a logical kind, the extension from this basic case to other more rarefied cases, so that we can take numbers as individual and talk of the properties of numbers, so that we can take, if you like, actions as individual and talk of the properties of actions, so that we can take propositions as individual and talk of the properties of propositions, and so forth.
And the examples that come to mind do have such a character, don't they?
Certainly. And so that some sort of exercise of, as it were, human imagination is involved in making this step.
So,
well, in the sense that we have an analogical extension of forms this time, rather than semantic contents, beyond their primary application.
Well, one day, one likes to dramatize these things, something of this form was used to express a proposition of a rather different kind. And in order for the hearers of this new proposition involving, so to speak, making new uses for old means, had to be imaginative in some of the ways we've been talking about to understand what was going on. That's the point. Isn't there, I mean, focusing on that move, isn't there a danger that he could only understand what was going on by somehow incorporating error into his thought, in somehow thinking of the subject too much like the subject of the other kind. I mean, let's suppose the sentence was the sentence like, his proposal was defeated.
I don't think that there has to be any sort of error made by the actual people who talk in this way. What I do think, and I think this is illuminating about the history of philosophy, is that the constant charge of reification, of treating what aren't things as if they were things, is justified, insofar as it is justified, by philosophers, not ordinary men, but philosophers taking these derivative forms too seriously, and at the same time being haunted by the original model. I mean, say, if the basic entities, the basic individuals are spatio-temporal objects or substantial objects, then if you take the derived grammatical forms too seriously, you may suppose that properties, propositions, all sorts of things have a quasi-substantial character which they don't have. But I don't think that this, so to speak, basic error which philosophers can make is implicit in the language. I think it's a philosophical error.
So it would be as wrong in these kind of cases to suppose that the ordinary man is misled as it would if you took some of his metaphors for talking about his mind, like in the back of my mind and on all that sort of thing.
Right. Though, of course, as soon as he starts to reflect, and as I said, the tendency to reflect philosophically is endemic in the species. Good. As soon as he starts to reflect, maybe he's liable to fall into these traps. As Wittgenstein pointed out, I mean, we are misled by surface grammatical analogies, by buried metaphors to bring the 2 points together, as you did. But we're misled not when we use these things in ordinary exchanges, but when we start to reflect. What's
wrong? Do you
wrong?
think that line can really be drawn so clearly, actually?
Yes, I do. What's wrong with the philosophers of the critical kind is that they overcorrect, as it were, because they see that there is a theoretical risk here. They think that somehow the forms are suspect.
Yes, and they try to provide translations of them.
And they try to provide translations of them.
Yes, and they
so
can't.
That, in a way, you can see the whole new move in theoretical semantics as a very old thing, fished up again.
I suppose it would follow from our speaking of this as I mean, in the ways we have, imaginative, metaphorical, the suggestion that it involves creative, that those translation procedures just are not going to be available in general.
So they're caught in a terrible dilemma, terrible for them.
One of the ways...
Amusing for us.
One of the ways it's efficacious, though I'm not sure you had this in mind, and maybe by saying how little this gets your thoughts, you can tell me the rest of it, is that, of course, it enables us to use... I mean, we're talking about the extension of a grammatical form.
Right.
It enables us to use, coupled with the new term in subject position, some term like his proposal, his defeat, and so on, a whole lot of already existing predicates, you see, without change.
Good, this is excellent. So this is where the exercise of imagination, as you put it, which is involved in the adaptation of the grammatical form for new purposes, goes along with and is married to that extension of particular predicates from their original application to their new application, as in defeated. I mean, defeat is something that happens to somebody in a battle, not to a proposal. Not to a proposal.
Yes. I wonder whether we couldn't... I don't know, maybe that's too bold.
So it's extraordinarily interesting, the notion that there is a union here of these two kinds of extension. The semantic extension, which you earlier illustrated by talking about water running, say, on the one hand, and the adaptation of the grammatico-logical form to receive new inhabitants.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There is a continuity here, isn't there, between things which we are perhaps accustomed to regard as discrepant or distinct, but which linguists or theorists of language, who are concerned after all with all uses of language, should be able to cope with. We spoke earlier of those, as we called them, imaginative extensions of the uses of ordinary predicates, ordinary words, and we considered the example of extending the word runs from, say, cats or animals or human beings to water. And I think rightly called this an imaginative step. And couldn't it be said that it's just the very same sort of imagination at work in characteristically poetic uses of language, in figures and tropes such as poets use? And to see water as running is, as it were, the same sort of thing as to see, well, to take a childish example, to see the cloud as a camel, or to take a more sophisticated example, to see the water, the river, as a strong brown god, or something like that, as in Eliot. And in general, what one would like to stress is the kind of continuity here in the use of language, and indeed in thinking in general, between the poet's vision, if you like, of the world and the ordinary person's vision of the world.
Yes, that poetry is contained as a possibility right in the germ of all language.
Yes, and otherwise, I mean, it would be utterly mysterious how we could understand the poet's tongue.
Yes.
If this were not so. If the poet's tongue wasn't, after all, our own tongue, in a rarefied, refined, and intensified form.
Because part of the thing that might be accounted for by looking at it in this way, reverting back now to what we said about the extent to which the meanings of the composite is based by a rule on the meanings of the two parts, the characteristic ambiguity of a lot of poetry.
Right.
Because it isn't yielded. I mean, you couple two terms, water and run, perhaps. I can't think of one which has a very obvious ambiguity at the moment, but you couple two terms, the output isn't yielded automatically by the semantic content that you have already. Good. And that's why you can't, you have this ambiguity.
Yes, and one's inclined to say that really no output is yielded quite automatically, or almost none. Right. I think this reverts to a point that you made, and that after all Hume made too, when he described the imagination and attributing to this faculty the key role in the application of general words at large. He described this as a magical faculty in the soul, which is properly called a genius and is strongest and the greatest genius. He used these highly elevated forms of words to talk about the ordinary person's capacity to apply ordinary general words over a range of course, similar, but also dissimilar cases.
Yes.
And it is, you might say, an extension of just the same faculty, which you find in characteristically poetic use of language.
And do you think the mystery he found in it was the extent to which it wasn't rule determined?
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's
yes.
so. That in a sense the rules escape us. And this in a way is equivalent to saying that we can't reduce it to rule or not to mechanical rule, and yet it's a faculty that we must all be possessed of for the most, in a way, prosaic, or nearly the most prosaic, exercises of the mind and uses of language, as for the most obviously and conventionally poetic.
What comes to mind is the thought that perhaps a lot of the emphasis placed on rules as an explanatory concept in our understanding of language has been actually misplaced.
Yes, and of course it's not only the matter of the extension, the trope in the individual word, the figurative use of the individual word, but I suspect I haven't been into this at all, that there is a similarly imaginative use of grammar in poetic language. But this is a subject
of investigation.
Of investigation.
Yes.
I have no views about it really, except that I suspect it must be so.
Yes.
Remember that footnote in Austin Fox's about a lovely thing that he used to puzzle about? Now let's see if I can remember it. Why is
water in toy beer bottles, not toy beer, but pretend beer.
Aha.
And so if I was being really belligerent on a certain occasion, I would say, and somebody asked me, what is Oxford philosophy? Really wanting to...
Ah, yes.
Lovely example of what
Lovely example. Actually, we don't need the complicated setting because the whole phrase, toy beer, is out. Like toy wine.
Why, though?
Or toy wool. Or toy...
Oh, but it wasn't real beer, you see, it was water. That was the point.
Yes. Yes, the point still holds that in no case do